Welcome to Creating Better Products, where we explore the journeys of product leaders and practitioners on their way towards creating extraordinary products. Join us as our guests share their real world experiences, not just the triumphs, but also the challenges and the lessons learned along the way. Even better, get actionable takeaways that you can apply tomorrow. I'm your host, Sabrina Mach. I have almost 2 decades of experience in product and design, but beyond my own experience, I really love learning from others. But I also know it can be really hard for individuals, including myself, to capture the unique experience and the value that we bring. This is why my mission is to share those untold stories of amazing product and design professionals with you and the world so that we can learn from each other together. Today, my guest is Chris Willis. Chris, he is a product leader at ThoughtWorks with a wide range of experiences across multiple sectors with a personal passion for EV and green tech. So EV, electric vehicles. And Chris has been doing research and running proof of concepts into how to improve public charging infrastructure and to create that frictionless EV driver experience. And that's the topic we will touch on today. Chris, welcome to the show.
Hi, Sabrina. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited diving into a topic as interesting as this. So if we think about electric vehicles and the ecosystem around that, how did you get into that topic, Chris? And what makes you an expert?
So I got into the subject or the topic because I drive for a start. So it's something kind of close to my heart. Heavily sort of involved in decarbonising the world and transport. I had, through the course of working in ThoughtWorks, I've worked with other businesses, car manufacturers, people around the transport sector as a whole. And I realized that from being a driver and also speaking to friends who are EV drivers, how kind of the experience was for them. So I started to poke my nose in because I'm inquisitive and nosy in that way. And from there, it's kind of bloomed out as kind of my side passion of interest and work.
Ah, fascinating. So you've been really going deep on this topic. I'd love to find out more about the research that you've done and maybe some of the proof of concepts that you've explored in this space. What were the different things that you've learned during this exploration?
Well, so it all started back at the beginning of January. We started doing some global surveys and followed those up with interviews with drivers from around the world. And what we kind of learned, it would be of no surprise to a lot of EV drivers, especially in Europe and in America, is a very fractured experience if you're a driver trying to navigate the current ecosystem of owning an EV. It's definitely not as frictionless as, say, owning a petrol or diesel car, which obviously, given where we want to go to in the world and we want to decarbonize the planet, it's quite important for us to make that experience a lot better. We've had some very interesting feedback from drivers, both Tesla drivers and non-Tesla drivers, from everything from owning the vehicle to the applications that they need to run and just manage day-to-day owning and charging an electric vehicle.
So if I hear Tesla drivers, my first impression would be that must be a great experience.
Yes, I think Tesla drivers would agree. For the most part, they've got a pretty nice deal. Though we did have an interesting experience when we were doing our interviews, when we started conducting our interviews with drivers. The Tesla drivers we were talking to then had no complaints about wait times, for instance, at charging stations. They were like, no, I can always turn up to a Tesla supercharger. They're always available. They're always free. I can just plug in and go. And then, because we were conducting research over a period of time, Tesla announced that they were going to allow third-party vehicles to start using the Tesla supercharger network. And even then, also Tesla sales had started to kind of increase in certain regions. And when we were then talking to Tesla drivers towards the end of our interview rounds, we started to hear like, oh yeah, no, actually, there's occasionally there's a wait time, and sometimes it's busy and there's people parked in the Tesla supercharger bays, and I was like starting to hear a lot of the same sort of problems, slightly lesser than what the other non-Tesla EV owners had been saying throughout the interviews.
Fascinating. So I guess from Tesla's perspective, it makes business sense to open up the network, and it's interesting to see the impact of that it then has on their
Yeah.
own existing customer base.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see how quickly Tesla decides to expand their supercharger network to accommodate third-party usage, especially in places like the United States.
Yeah, and you mentioned that beyond Tesla, the ecosystem is really fragmented.
Yeah.
How does that show itself?
So unlike Tesla, which is what we would consider in the industry as kind of a closed walled garden. I mean, obviously now it allows third party usage of the Tesla supercharger network. Obviously, Tesla owns the car, it owns the application that you use to manage the car, and it owns the charging network. So it has that vertical integration that means that it can focus more on a kind of unified flow for drivers, a unified experience. Whereas on the other side, you have a range of different car manufacturers. You've got new car manufacturers that are coming into the market, with the likes from China and Rivian from the States. Tesla is also a new entrant into here that has been around for considerably longer than some of the new startups. And then you don't have that closed wall. So you have energy companies that are creating charging station networks. You have third-party startups that are creating the sort of applications in the middle to access those networks for the drivers. And as you can imagine, there's like been a hyper growth period of people kind of opening networks and doing all of these new fantastic things. But the technology underneath is still also evolving. So there's this kind of hyper growth, but also continuous like new ways of doing things, new ways of approaching building out charging stations. So you've now got this mishmash of old, and I say old when I say 5 years, 7 year old infrastructure, meeting new infrastructure, meeting new vehicles, just creating fractions. And then on top of that, obviously the commercial models that go with that. You've got companies trying to interact with other companies, all seeking to make profits somewhere within the ecosystem. So it's fractured in that way that they can't provide the same closed wall, unified Tesla experience, but there are definitely things that they could do that make it better, even without that unified ability.
Yeah, interesting. So that helps us understand the ecosystem a little bit from the provider side. Now, how does that feel for the EV drivers? What does that look like for them day to day? Is it really that bad?
Well, yeah. I mean, so I can give you the best experience of a non-Tesla driver, just having to have two apps on their phone, which is very, very uncommon. So that's the app to manage their car from the car manufacturer, and then they had one to access a public charging network that was right outside of their house. To the other side of the range, where I spoke to someone who had 16 apps to manage charging, and they were in a city in Germany. So it wasn't that they were in the middle of nowhere and it was kind of like where they traveled to, they had to download another app. They were always relatively within their local area, but there's just so many different networks and they're not all linked up. They're not communicating with each other. It's hard to communicate with all of them at the same time. So every time they had to go to a different charger, they had to have a different app to access that charger, which obviously very frustrating from someone who's trying to just charge their car. To then also where chargers are placed and what type of chargers are placed in different places. The classic example that I can give is in around by me, I've got a sort of hypercharger, a super fast 250 kilowatt charger, outside of my local gym, which can charge a car in 25 to 30 minutes. And I've got a 5 kilowatt charger at the biggest Tesco's in my city. Well, obviously, a 5 kilowatt charger for an EV is going to take a long time to charge a car, much longer than what you're expecting to do your shopping for. Even if you're doing a big family weekly shop, you're going to, and this Tesco's isn't surrounded by many other places that you'd want to go to unless you're planning on spending, well, I suppose 4 hours at IKEA, which is, achievable at the best of times once you're into IKEA, versus at the gym where 25 minutes is quite short for a class. So your car is going to be sat at that charger incurring idling fees because it's now 100% charged and you're still in your 1 hour gym session or 1 hour gym class. Means that people are going to be put off from using those. That gives the interpretation, of course, and a signal to businesses that actually, oh, well, people aren't using these chargers, so why should we bother putting them in? Maybe it's because the strategy and the placement for them wasn't quite correct. And then that obviously has a knock-on impact for the operators, has a knock-on impact for growth in the area. That has an impact for EV drivers because it restricts the number of chargers that might be installed in the area.
And that's really fascinating, because here we really see that when we look at the driver's perspective, how that infrastructure could and maybe should work is a very different lens than if we look at the technology and maybe just, how many stations have we installed across Germany. But here we're really seeing what might drive or hinder adoption of those stations.
Yeah.
And it also seems a treasure trove for insights for innovation of how to actually really make this successful and take off beyond maybe the existing strategies.
Yeah, and so the work that we've been doing with the POCs, and we've been looking at basically how to make this as frictionless for the EV driver as possible. The classic example is talking to some of the interviewers, and I heard quite often how people would spend hours on a Sunday night if they were doing a long journey, or the night before they're doing a long journey the next day. They'd spend hours planning where they were going to stop and charge, how long it would take them to get there. And I mean, for everybody else, we haven't, since the invention of GPS and Google Maps, and we haven't had to think about like planning a long journey for 2 decades in reality. So to have that come back in because you've got an EV is going to be off-putting for drivers and for future drivers as well. And it's kind of not necessary. We should be able to do on-the-spot route planning. EV charging stations should be part of a map system. It should be a case of that the car, which is incredibly intelligent, can detect when the driver's going to need to stop and charge, and can make those suggestions using the apps and the operators and find the best route to the best charger based on what the driver wants to do. It's kind of a difficult marketplace at the moment for a lot of the operators because it's quite expensive to install obviously charging stations in areas. So if you don't see that return on investment, then it's because of maybe bad placement or just unlucky in terms of like where you've actually been able to secure a site to put the charging stations down, and you don't have that revenue coming in. Obviously that loss or the lack of earnings is going to hinder any kind of future investment, and it's certainly going to hinder you taking a proactive look at, let's see what fun new features we can put in, and let's see what we can do to make it better for the driver. Because at that point in time, you're like, well, I've spent millions on installing a network and I'm not really getting what I wanted back from this.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, right? Because the need to charge electric vehicles is there without a doubt.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're starting to hear that some companies are cutting back on growing the infrastructure because they have found it hard to make it successful. And that seems to be going back to exactly what you've said. Are these stations installed in the right location with the right charging power to really drive that adoption? because I mean, no one wants to go to a petrol station or electric charging station and hang around there for an hour or however long it takes. It's also the question, how can we integrate this into people's lives more seamlessly so that they don't ever have to think about charging the vehicle again, but that happens as they go about their life.
Yeah.
And that's something that seems to have not been solved yet.
No, I mean, this is it. So jobs to be done, really. It's not just a numbers game when it comes to where EV chargers are, though a lot of places do treat it a bit of as a numbers game. It's a numbers game with intelligent kind of understanding of why a person's going to have a car there for a particular amount of time, how many cars might be in that area that will need charging at a particular point in time. So ramping up charging on the autobahn or on the motorways in the UK at service stations there with super fast chargers and hyper rapid chargers obviously makes sense, because no one wants to stick around a service station for particularly long periods of time. There's going to be a high traffic area of people using those busy roads to get places. So having banks of those would be an intelligent option. And then, but at your local park, or maybe an amusement park, or I always use the example of like Disneyland. Disney wants people to stay in their park for 12 hours. So having a super fast charger or a rapid charger going up to 250, 300 kilowatts makes no sense for Disney, right? It makes sense to have banks of 22 kilowatt chargers there, because they want their guests to turn up, park, plug in their car, and 12 hours later come back to a charged vehicle. They don't want them to leave to have to move their car because of they're incurring an idle fee, or that the car's just full, and it's nice manners to move your car once it's full. So it's that kind of thinking that needs to happen. And there are companies out there that are beginning to think that way. We're seeing more curbside chargers that are slower chargers. They're not super fast or rapid chargers. So, with the idea that someone's going to park their car and it's probably going to be parked there overnight to charge a vehicle. So there is definitely work going on there. There are still, to my mind, issues with not just where and the placement, but also how we actually approach charging as a whole. I don't think it's particularly demographically friendly.
What do you mean by that?
So if we look at the demographics of EV owners kind of today and for the last 5 to 10 years, obviously you're talking about Tesla as leading the way in electric vehicles. Early EV owners, obviously your quintessential early adopters, want the best, newest technology, are happy to pay more, also happy to have an experience that isn't as finessed, isn't as great, in order to know that they've got the best of the best technology. That demographic kind of extends to early majority, but typically with EVs, it's affluent, young to middle aged, tech savvy or tech native, and male. Lots of our respondents to this global survey were male. And from that, the ecosystem and the way that people are approaching the technology has definitely, I think, has been skewed. So the placement of chargers, for instance, in back corners of car parks, I personally wouldn't want to be in a dark corner for a prolonged period of time, inside or outside of my car, in certain areas. So it can be, difficult for women and everybody in that situation. Then the use of certain technologies like QR codes to access the network, the use of apps. I mean, this is fine if you're tech savvy or tech native, or you're an early adopter who's willing to kind of like test and learn and push and find out and try different things. But if you're not tech savvy, then accessing that charger is actually quite problematic for you. I always liken it to, my 80-year-old mother. If we turned and said tomorrow or in 2026, no more petrol, no more diesel, how would she handle the EV, like owning an EV right now? Like, going and publicly accessing a public charger network would be very difficult for her. She typically is like, she uses a smartphone, but uses it to call and occasionally text, but mostly it's calling because that's what she's used to. And there's a whole demographic of drivers that there is a higher barrier to entry if we make things for the tech savvy, tech native. Yeah.
So what do you, and maybe that's a hypothetical question, but what do you see as the barrier to companies thinking more holistically about the driver experience? What leads to that focus on maybe a specific demographic? And what are maybe ways in how to expand thinking there? What are steps that organizations could take to adopt an approach that takes advantage actually of many of the opportunities that you've mentioned in this conversation?
Well, I don't think there's a particular barrier, and I don't think there's any intention behind this. I think it's kind of that. I think the ecosystem is the ecosystem because of where it started and how it began, and you've sort of followed a path really, and that path wasn't intentional. It just is the way that things. People are always just kind of like trying to do something else, and we've kind of, to a certain extent, limited by thinking about having, for instance, cars plugged in. That simple decision of like using a plug to charge the car versus, say, what NIO is doing in China and starting to introduce into Europe, which is battery swapping. Just that simple decision to do with we will charge through this plug has limited benefits, but it also limits what we can do. How companies can adopt like a better way is honestly is start thinking about driver actions, driver experience. What is standout for you in your business? Like what's the standout USP, the unique selling point for your application, for your network, above and beyond anybody else's, that you can offer to the driver, and how best to get that into the driver's hands. And if we take some of the POCs that we're running at the moment, we're looking at reservations, how you can build reservations into the mobile application, and push that through to a charging station, which could be beneficial for drivers on the go, but equally it could be beneficial for Hilton hotels who want to offer their top tier loyalty program guests free access to a charger during their stay. And there's ways and means of doing it. This creates a better experience, a nice unique selling point for that brand, for those chargers, right? It's something that makes it sticky for I think the driver will remember that, because at the moment a lot of stuff is rinse and repeat. Well, 100% of the interviewees that we had, when we followed up why they had so many apps and would they, do they see value in this, they all said no, they're just there to access a charging network. There's no unique inherent value past it gives me access to this thing. So if something else comes along cheaper, then they're gone. The driver will move onto that cheaper network or that more convenient network. So yeah, I think taking a look at the standards that exist inside of the open charging protocols and actually start to really kind of like go, can we use something here and how can we exploit this? I say reservations because for the drivers, this could be a great way of them making sure that they can continue on their way when they have to stop, by having a dedicated charger at the service station for when they arrive. But it also opens up a revenue stream for the charging station operator, right? They can charge a fee for that. So there is business value into that. And for the MSP, it's a sticky thing. We've got reservations in our application and no one else has. I mean, for now anyway, no one else has.
Yeah, fascinating. And as you were highlighting some of the aspects, I just realized that even you and me today, we started talking about the EV ecosystem. We were started talking about the thing. Yeah. And actually, what it's really about is the driver experience. So even just framing what we're talking about differently can nudge our thinking significantly. And I just realized that even we've fallen into this trap today
Yeah.
of thinking about the technology and the infrastructure and the ecosystem of charging, when actually where we need to start from is the drivers, and how can we make that experience easy and enjoyable. It should not just be easy, but it should be fun. I know sometimes that's looked down upon, but making that a good experience is something that's valuable and that people will return to, even when we talk about charging. How can we go beyond that?
It should be owning an EV with all of the bells and whistles that electric vehicles have should be better. It should be a better experience owning an electric vehicle than owning a petrol car. Bar maybe a Corvette or your sort of like very high end supercars, in which case I can kind of get behind that. There's other additional elements of that are only enough for those experiences. But you've got an incredibly smart car. You've got smart plugs and sockets for accessing charging station. The software defined vehicles. In my mind, there is always something that we can do here that will make the experience not just equal to owning a petrol car or an internal combustion engine vehicle. We can make it better if you keep pushing how we look at the ecosystem from the driver. At the end of the day, it comes to the point where we shouldn't need apps. Apps shouldn't be the barrier to accessing the charging network. And we should be able to create a way that's frictionless. Just plug your car in and walk away. And the car, as an intelligent vehicle, handles everything else for you and makes it super simple for people. So for people that don't want apps, they can just plug their car in. For people that do want apps, they can still have those apps. They can still do all of the funky things that might come from that. Being able to figure out where's the best place to charge, where's the which network is slightly faster, which ones give me better loyalty points and stuff like that. Those don't go away by making the driving experience better for the wider demographics. It just makes it better for everybody else.
Yeah, because today we don't need an app to fill up our car with petrol, but we do have to have one for EVs.
It's in some way, shape, or form, someone has an app on their car for their car if they've got an electric vehicle.
So we talked about a lot of super interesting insights. Some were friction points in the driver experience today. I'm going to stay away from talking about the ecosystem. And you also shared some opportunities. Maybe just as a short summary, what was the one surprising thing as a positive thing that you found out as part of this research? And what was maybe on the dark side, something negative where you were like, well, really? I didn't expect that at all.
Okay, so a positive sign that kind of is interesting for those out there in the world that are looking at joining this market. So when we did the global survey, we opened it up to the world, and we actually had 8.7% of our responses came from Latin America, and all of them were positive in the fact that they wanted an electric vehicle. But the thing that was holding them back the most was lack of infrastructure. So a positive, I would say, for a lot of things is that for Latin America, if we can get this right, Latin America can leapfrog a lot of these frictions that we've kind of built into our infrastructure. They can think about this in a completely different way. And I liken it back to how in Kenya and Africa, they leapfrogged mobile banking by thinking about banking completely different way when you don't have physical banks. And you can do that with Latin America in this way. We can use distributed energy resources like solar and wind to be able to make truly independent charging stations in areas so that you can build up that infrastructure in a very clean, carbon neutral way. So there's definitely a positive there. Even where there is no infrastructure, there are people that are definitely into and want to adopt electric vehicles. And then probably the darkest side, the one that I kind of worries me the most inside of America is that growth level of electric vehicles. It's really going to be very difficult for America to grow out that infrastructure as the infrastructure in America exists today. I think it's not completely understood by European counterparts and by UK, but the electrical grid in America, the way that it's set up, the way that it was built, and the way that it's kind of maintained makes it really difficult to suddenly add in huge amounts of electric load and demand in the course of the electric vehicles. Unlike in especially Western Europe and the UK, where actually we built our grid with a little bit more give. We actually over-engineered, like classically they say, we over-engineered the capacity of our grids to be able to. So now we can kind of quickly benefit from this because we can build out dedicated charging stations and ramp them up. Whereas in America, as Tesla tests, you really are not just installing the charging stations and hooking them up to the electric grid, you're building the grid at the same time in order to get the power there. That's going to be a hard problem for them, a dark path that they're going to have to go down. It's going to be costly for them in that situation. But once they're there, I think they'll really see the benefit of it. And they've got, a lot of good and bad. They've got a lot of area that they have to build out to.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing, Chris. I'm wondering now for our listeners who might be thinking, wow, there's a lot of really interesting insights and perspective in here. What is one thing or two things that you would recommend to our listeners that they can do tomorrow? One action they take away from things that you've learned or from the insight that you've gained that is maybe a small step, might not be as big as going to South America and exploring that market, because that seems like a big step. But what's one small or two small things that listeners could do tomorrow when they go back to work and feel inspired by what you shared?
Well, so if you're a charging station operator, a charge point operator, I would say what you definitely need to be looking at, and if you listen to newsletters from driver communities and from EV communities, start looking at dynamic pricing. Start looking at how you are building out your network, not just from a where do I have available space to build something, but actually, again, to that jobs to be done. That's definitely important and is, I think, going to be a key part of any success going forward. We've got that hyper growth, but we're starting to see the declines. We're starting to see the kind of mergers in the market that happen when the land grab phase is over of any new technology. And I think that will be for a lot of the charging station operators, a lot of charge point operators. It's going to be that where we put our chargers and what chargers we put there, based on what the driver needs to do while they're there, that's going to be a key defining point for them. So if you're not looking at that, if you haven't got a strategy that's addressing those points, definitely I would take a look and go, are we meeting what drivers need to do when they're charging their car? And if you're an MSP, I would be hammering at the car manufacturers to trying to get a better access to the car information, state of charge, driver behavior, because from that you're just gonna unlock so many other features, so many more useful elements to your customers. And on the flip side, if you're a car manufacturer, again, state of charge access that isn't cloud-based, isn't delayed, isn't dependent on things, but it's more edge processing and available to MSPs via the phone, maybe through Apple CarPlay integration. I know is looking at this. There's Android Auto and automotive implementations as well. But having that edge processing to the phone that then allows for things like ad hoc route planning based on the state of charge for the battery, based on user and driver behavior, and having a way of being able to present that information. That's going to be a very unique view, especially in the early days, and will just enhance the driver experience, which will give you stickiness. It will give you that ability to attract and retain drivers going forward. But overall,
Wow.
the infrastructure is fragmented. But everybody needs to be looking at it from the driver's perspective and driving a future that's like, we want this to be frictionless for the people who are providing the cash, at the end of the day, and that is the drivers.
Yeah. And they're also the ones who will drive adoption, and whatever different players in that ecosystem are offering, they're the key to success and making that sticky and successful. Maybe just a small footnote, because I always struggle with acronym. MSP, Chris, I believe, is mobility service providers.
Yes. So they are essentially the apps, the providers of those apps on people's phones. They can be the charge station operators, so like Shell Recharge or BP Pulse. They have apps that are called MSPs, and they're one and the same. But then you've also got independent ones like Plug Surfing, and my brain goes now. But yeah, Plug Surfing, which is sort of more of an independent MSP that provides access to charging networks, but doesn't necessarily own a charging network themselves.
Cool. Thank you, Chris. And before we go, one final question to kind of close our loop on the topic today. With all the things that we discussed today, why is this important for creating better products?
Right. So we need to decarbonize. In order to decarbonize, we need people to want to decarbonize. People will want a better experience, better products. But at the end of the day, the money inside of this ecosystem, inside of this sector, the EV, it comes from the driver. If you don't create better products, then you're not going to get driver uptake or driver retention. If we keep with what this friction provides, we're locking out demographics. We're locking out demographics of people that, will struggle to adopt EVs, and that has a knock-on impact as we go. Right, we want to increase EV adoption. We want to increase EV sales. We want to make sure that this is done in a way that supports everybody and is equitable for everybody. So we need to look at it from a driver experience, create products that solve driver needs, and then we will continue to see a bigger conversion into EVs, and we'll continue to see that retention. And hopefully, as I said before, we'll see decarbonisation of the transport system as a result.
Yeah, and I think that's maybe almost the more important and pressing goal to solve for us and humanity, is how can we make it easier for people to adopt those new technologies so that we can be on a road towards decarbonization and building a better future with the resources that we have on this planet. So thank you so much, Chris. It's been truly inspiring what you've shared. And I have one final question for you. What are 3 resources, books, articles that you're inspired by? It could be on decarbonization or the ecosystem or the driver experience or anything else that's kind of inspired you that you think might be valuable for our listeners.
So I'll do the shameless plug of ThoughtWorks from the start one. We've released very recently a report on software-defined vehicles. So I definitely, absolutely go and have a look at that, because that tells you a lot about the future of where vehicles are going. We're past the age of dumb pistons and explosives. We're definitely into the modern world of electronics and programming. So definitely would take a look at that. And then from a EV news and perspective that kind of covers a whole range of stuff, EV Universe, they produce a newsletter. Sign up to them. They're great. As I said, insights from all over the ecosystem, from what's happening in charging stations to what's happening in car manufacturing, battery tech. So I read that quite often to get an very quick update on what's happening in the world. And then completely sort of left field, if you're not already reading The Verge or listening to the Vergecast, then you absolutely need to. They do great reviews of tech in general, but actually quite interestingly talk about the wider ecosystem. They look at the big players. And Nilay Patel, who's head of The Verge, owns an electric vehicle. So every now and again, that also then crops in there his ownership of an F-150 Lightning. So I definitely recommend having a listen on that one as well.
Wonderful. And where can people find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn, so you can find me under Chris Willis, or reach out to me via chris.willis@thoughtworks.com. Yeah, happy to respond to emails.
Wonderful, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your experience. It's been really, really inspiring. So thank you so much for your time.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Chris. And now a question to our listeners. What is your experience in creating better products in the EV ecosystem? Or let's flip it around as we realized. Let's talk about the driver experience. How have you been able to do this? What were your successes and maybe setbacks? What was hard that you didn't expect to be hard? Please share your experience. I would love to hear about it. Either share it directly in the comments or reach out to me and maybe have you as a guest on the show sometime soon. And finally, if you liked this episode as much as I did, please share it with your network and give us a like in your favorite streaming platform. By doing this, you help to elevate the voice of our amazing guests, and in this case, of the wonderful Chris Willis. So thank you for joining and see you next time.